Sartre presents this idea that the work of art is an appeal which is a pun on appel. Appel means both a call and an appeal. Then he goes on to say that if I appeal to my readers so that we may carry the enterprise which I have begun to a successful conclusion, it is self-evident that I consider him as a pure freedom, as an unconditioned activity. The reader is considered as a pure freedom. So reader has a function in Sartre's scheme. He represents an activity. He participates in the process of creation, and unconditioned activity. That is, he has pure freedom. The author does not exercise any control on him. And therefore, the author should not try to affect him. In no case can I address myself to his passiveness, that is, try to affect him. Now, here passiveness may not mean only passivity, but it may probably mean passions or affections, the emotions. So the author should not try to overwhelm the reader with the passions or emotions. And you see, this is the pitfall of translation. So obviously the translation of passiveness here is not adequate. That is, try to affect him, to communicate to him from the very first emotions of fear, desire or anger. This is what Sartre says I cannot do to my reader. That is, I cannot try to affect him or overwhelm him. There are doubtless authors who concern themselves solely with arousing these emotions because they are foreseeable, manageable, and because they have at their disposal surefire means of provoking them. But it is also true that they are reproached for this kind of thing, as Euripides has been since antiquity, because their children appear on the stage. So authors who provoke the emotions of the reader, Sartre says that it is very easy to do so, but it is difficult to present the emotions at the same time not to provoke the reader too much. That is, the author must leave some space for the reader, for him to react in his own way. The author must not provoke the reader too much or overwhelm him. And a little later, Sartre quotes Jean Genet, the dramatist, who says that this is a politeness or courtesy of the author extended to the reader, that the author is not being overbearing. So emotions are foreseeable, manageable, and so on. So they are easy to control for the author, but the author should not provoke the reader too much. Admitting children on stage would mean that the audience would be too easily, provoked. They might feel pity for the children too easily. So Euripides has been criticized, Sartre says, for taking this easy option. Freedom is alienated in the state of passion. It is abruptly engaged in partial enterprises. It loses sight of its task, which is to produce an absolute end. So if somebody is passionate, he loses control over himself. Therefore, he loses his freedom. So, violent passions, emotions, they curb one's freedom. And why is freedom important? The reader must have his freedom so that it may look forward to an absolute end, that is the absolute interpretation of the text that he wants to arrive at. But he loses sight of this if he is carried away by emotions. And the book is no longer anything but a means for feeding hate or desire. The writer should not seek to overwhelm. So it is very important. So a book should not be used for provoking hate or desire. These are the simplest things to do. And today perhaps you see that many political parties indulge in this. They provoke hate or desire by the text they produce. And that is the simplest thing to do, particularly for an audience, for readers who are not highly trained. They are easily carried away by the desire or the emotion of anger or hatred, whatever, produced by the text. Not all readers are critical readers. Okay, so this is the easiest thing to do, and that is what an author says should refrain from doing. Otherwise, he is in contradiction with himself. If he wishes to make demands, he must propose only the task to be fulfilled. So the author is making a demand upon the reader, and when he is making a demand upon the reader, he must also provide the reader some space for him to think in his own way or to react in his own way. The reader must be able to make a certain aesthetic withdrawal. This is what Gautier foolishly confused with art for art's sake, and the Parnassians with the imperturbability of the artist. So here is Sartre's criticism of art for art's sake. As I pointed out earlier, that Sartre's theory seems similar to art for art's sake, but it is different. Even though Sartre does not offer a teleological argument, that is, that art should have some ulterior end or goal, yet his argument is not that of art for art's sake. And what is wrong with art for art's sake? The romantic poet Gautier, who propounded this theory, Sartre says that it does not allow the reader a space where he can withdraw, aesthetically withdraw. And the Parnassian poets, they thought that the artist should be imperturbable. But these theories, they do not adequately explain the function of the reader, or they do not provide the reader with space. So in art for art's sake, the attitude of the artist is that he knows, the best possible interpretation of art, and the audience or the reader must be overwhelmed by the art, because this art is made for the sake of art, and that art is best understood by the artist who created it. Therefore, the reader has almost no space. The artist does not leave the audience or the reader any space of his own. So there is an arrogant attitude in art for art's sake. The artist is an aestheticist, and in this aestheticist theory, what is emphasized? The work of art, and not the world, or not the object, and also not the reader or the observer. So M.H. Abrams has a book, The Mirror and the Lamp, which is an excellent book on romantic theory, and I am writing the name of the author. So feelings are, of course, important in a work of art. It appears through our tears. If it is comic, it will be recognized by laughter. these feelings are of a particular kind. They have their origin in freedom. They are loaded. They are loaned. The belief which I accord the tale is freely assented to. It is a passion in the Christian sense of the word. That is a freedom which resolutely puts itself into a state of passiveness to obtain a certain transcendent effect by this sacrifice. So there is a place for feelings in a work of art, but Sartre says they are loaned. Why they are loaned? Because these feelings are created by the artist and offered to the reader. But then he uses the metaphor of Christian passion. Now, Christian passion, you know, it does not mean only sensation or feeling. So, passion has the sense of sacrifice and a state of passiveness. So, this is a kind of freedom which resolutely puts itself into a state of passiveness to obtain a certain transcendent effect by this sacrifice. We all know that it refers to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. In the case of a work of art, the artist must sacrifice by offering the reader or the audience some space, that is some kind of passiveness on the part of the artist is required. The reader renders himself credulous, he descends into credulity, and so on. So the reader agrees to believe, credulous. So he agrees to believe, or he temporarily, offers his credulity. And the work of art encloses him like a dream, at every moment conscious of being free. As if willingly the reader temporarily loses his or her freedom, allows himself to be enclosed by the work of art like a dream, even though he is conscious that he is free. An effort is sometimes made to force the writer into this dilemma. Either one believes in your story and it is intolerable, or one does not believe in it and it is ridiculous. So, if the author is bent upon making his story, credible to the reader, then he may face this dilemma. Either one believes the story, but it is intolerable. Why intolerable? Because the reader willingly loses his freedom in believing the story. So it is unbearable, because the reader must have some freedom, or one does not believe in it and it is ridiculous. So if one does not believe in the story at all, if the reader does not lend his credulity, then the work appears to him ridiculous. So you pick up Sartre's text, Why Write, and say, I do not believe a word in this book. So this book becomes ridiculous to you. Or you can have a reverential attitude towards the book and you say, I entirely submit my credulity and I believe everything in this book. Then the book becomes unbearable to you because you have no freedom. Alright. So it is a kind of negotiation of space between the author and the reader. The argument is absurd because the characteristic of aesthetic consciousness is to be a belief by means of commitment, by oath, a belief sustained by fidelity to oneself and to the author, a perpetually renewed choice to believe. So, Sartre says that this is actually an exaggeration. So, the last sentence, that either you believe then it is either you believe it and then it is intolerable, or you do not believe it, then it is ridiculous. This is actually an exaggeration. So things are not in so stark contrast. Things are not completely in black and white. So there are shades, which means that there are, there are spaces left for both the author and the reader, and the reader willingly, becomes loyal to the author and chooses to believe. I can awaken at every moment and I know it, but I do not want to. Reading is a free dream. Well, that happens to all of us in the early morning. We choose to wake up. If we do not want to wake up, we feel lazy, we feel sleepy. So it is our matter of choice. So children often do that, they keep their eyes tightly shut, even though everybody is awake around him. So he refuses to wake up. So it is a choice. And similarly the reader may either be immersed in the fiction of the story of the book, or the reader may want to wake up and start examining and say, no, I do not believe it. So the act of reading is like an act of dream. As long as you are agreeable to sleep and to dream, you are accepting whatever the fiction is offering you. But the moment you do not want to accept it anymore, you wake up and then start looking at the work critically. So that all feelings which are exacted on the basis of this imaginary belief are like particular modulations of my freedom. Notice the words, imaginary belief. So when a reader believes something in the world, he actually does not believe it, but he lends his credulity. His belief is imaginary. What Coleridge said, willing suspension of disbelief, something similar to that. That is, whether a reader believes or not believes, that is completely by his act of will. So no reader truly believes anything in a text. It is not possible. Why not possible? Because it is the product of another person's consciousness, and you can never enter the consciousness of another person. So you are always looking through the filter of your subjectivity. And if you say that, yes, I believe what the reader has to offer, this is your make-believe. You think that you believe, but it is not possible to believe. How can you enter the consciousness of another person? So it is make-believe. Okay. That is also true about communication. In spite of so many theories of language, communication is the last thing that we understand. We think that we understand one another, but do we? We never fully understand. So I am saying something to you, you are hearing it. How much of my intent you understand? So how will I assess that you understand 10% of what I was thinking or I was saying? I have no way to assess because I cannot enter your consciousness. So I imagine. Let me say, I imagine you understand 50% of what I am thinking. And I think I understand 50% of what Sartre is saying in this book. So, by simple calculation, you understand 25% of what Sartre is saying. Well, so I am joking, but what I want to say is that it is not possible to enter another person's consciousness, and therefore 100% communication is impossible. So, far from absorbing or masking it, there are so many different ways it has chosen to reveal to itself. What has chosen to reveal itself? Well, the feelings, they are different ways by which the meaning of the work has chosen to reveal itself. Raskolnikov, as I said, would only be a shadow without the mixture of repulsion and friendship which I feel for him and which makes him live. But by reversal, which is the characteristic of the imaginary object, it is not his behavior which excites my indignation or esteem, but my indignation and esteem which give consistency and objectivity to his behavior. Sartre is repeating his idea that characters in a novel, they do not have flesh and blood. They do not have real emotions or passions. It is the readers who invest them with emotion and passion of their own and make the characters seem to be real. So the character in Dostoevsky, Raskolnikov, my hatred, my indignation, they make him a character with feelings. Thus the reader's feelings are never dominated by the object, and as no external reality can condition them, they have their permanent source in freedom. The object, the book, Dostoevsky's book, it cannot dominate the reader's feelings unless the reader willingly lends his feelings to the characters. No external reality can condition them. They have their permanent source in freedom. That is, the book is an external reality, but the book does not have any power to condition the reader's emotions unless the reader decides to be moved by the book, and then he emotes or reacts with his emotions. And what is the source of this? What is the source of these emotions? The reader's freedom. The reader freely chose or selected or decided to invest his emotions in the book. So this is in concerns with Sartre's existential philosophy, the definition of freedom. Freedom, we remember, is the gap between the subject and the object. So here, a book is an external object which offers me some storyline or some structure, but it is bare unless I fill it up. I fill all the empty slots with my emotions, and then I make it look like real. I make the characters real with my emotions. So this is in consonance with existentialism, existential idea of freedom, the freedom of choice, and the phenomenological idea of the subject and object. So the reader's feelings are never dominated. They have their permanent source in freedom, that is, they are all generous. Or I call a feeling generous, which has its origin and its end in freedom. So the feelings are generous. Why generous? Because the reader, out of his own free will, generously agrees to act upon or to react on the book. Thus, reading is an exercise in generosity, and what the writer requires of the reader is not the application of an abstract freedom, but the gift of his whole person, with his passions, his prepossessions, his sympathies, his sexual temperament, and his scale of values. So the reader gives his whole person to the book. His emotions, his sympathies, temperament, and values. only this person will give himself generously. Freedom goes through and through him and comes to transform the darkest masses of his sensibility. Freedom goes through and through him, through the reader. So when the reader is exercising his freedom in the act of reading, the act of reading is also transforming him because he is exercising his freedom. And his sensibility is transformed by the act of reading. And as activity has rendered itself passive in order for it better to create the object, vice versa, passiveness becomes an act. Activity has rendered itself passive, that is, in the act of reading, the writer withdraws his activity. And passiveness becomes an act. That is, passiveness here in the sense of passion of the reader. The reader is passionately engaged with the book, so it becomes an act. The man who is reading has raised himself to the highest degree. That is the act. Why does the man raise himself to the highest degree? Because the man has offered his whole being, his emotions, his morality, his sexuality, his values, everything to the book. And that is why he has raised himself. That is why we see people who are known for their toughness shed tears at the recital of imaginary misfortunes. A man who we ordinarily know to be a very tough man may be weeping, reading something, reading a text, reading a book or a poem. Why? Because he has invested himself emotionally, totally to the book or to the text that he is reading. So at that moment his toughness withdraws. He is passive in the sense of passion, passion of Christ. So Christ sacrifices himself. Similarly, the reader sacrifices all his feelings, all his being, all his desire, everything to the book, and that is why he weeps. For the moment they have become what they would have been if they had not spent their lives hiding their freedom from themselves. Very intelligent, clever and humanist statement. A man who always wears a tough look, always appears to be cruel, does not know that he has the freedom to be kind. Or he knows it but he hides it. He conceals it. He does not want to see his soft side. But when a poem or a book provokes him, then he discovers this freedom, this area which he had so far suppressed or repressed. So you see how reading becomes an act of freedom. It is not only freedom because the reader chooses to read something and invest himself in that, but it is freedom in the sense that the reader also discovers that he has, so many sides in his character which he had repressed. So when we read a character who is a criminal in Dostoevsky, then we discover that we have these criminal instincts in ourselves. We repress them because we want to be good in society. So, various things the reader discovers while reading. And that is why it is also an act of freedom for the reader, because everything that he had suppressed so far is allowed to, resurface. Thus the author writes in order to address himself to the freedom of readers, and he requires it in order to make his work exist. But he does not stop there, he also requires that they return this confidence which he has given them. That they recognize his creative freedom and that they in turn solicit it by a symmetrical and inverse appeal. The author wants the reader to recognize that the author used his creative freedom to create the work. And as the author sends an appeal to the reader, he expects a reverse or inverse act from the reader, that the reader must also appeal to the writer. Here there appears the other dialectical paradox of reading. The more we experience our freedom, the more we recognize that of the other. The more he demands of us, the more we demand of him. So reading becomes an act of synthesis of the mutual feelings of writer and reader. The writer demands of the reader that he invests himself in the book, that he recognizes the writer's creativity, and the reader discovers the other in the writer. The reader experiences his freedom, but at the same time recognizes that it is not he who created this book, it is the writer, so he recognizes the other. I remember the 3 points of the triangle in M.H. Abrams. So the work, the reader and the world, they are all right. The work stands for the objective critical theory, when one emphasizes the work. When one emphasizes the writer, it is the aestheticist theory, and when one emphasizes the world, then it is the mimetic theory. There is imitation of the world and its reflection. Then he gives an example. When I have enchanted the landscape, I know very well that it is not I who created it, but I also know that without me, the relations which are established before my eyes among the trees, the foliage, the earth and the grass do not exist at all. I know that I can give no reason for the appearance of finality which I discover in the assortment of hues and in the harmony of the forms and movements created by the wind, yet it exists. There it is before my eyes, and I can make something more out of what is already there. So when we are looking at natural beauty, we are looking at a beautiful landscape, then Sartre here is using the phenomenological idea that the relations which we see in the landscape that please me, these relations can be perceived because of my consciousness. I know that. But I cannot give any reason for the appearance of finality which I discovered there. So here Sartre is drawing from the Kantian aesthetics finality without end, or the kind of sublimity which Kant saw in natural beauty. You remember that Kant equated the sublime in natural beauty with the sublime in the work of art, and Sartre differed with Kant there. He thought that the two kinds of sublimes are different. Here he is drawing from Kant and is speaking of the sublime in nature, but for the appearance of finality. So when we look at a beautiful sunset, we are amazed by seeing this beautiful scene which it seems that has been created for me to enjoy, and it has some kind of a finality which gives me this sense of fulfillment, but I do not know from where this finality comes. So Kant famously said, "Zweck Mrs. Kite ohne Zweck." Finality without purpose is without purpose. You remember? So Sartre said that when you look at a beautiful scene in nature, you do not know from where this finality comes. yet it exists. There it is before my eyes, and I can make something more out of what is already there. Because I add something of my emotions to the scene, and I can make more of it. So, so if I am a banker, I go and look at the sunset, but I keep thinking of the credit and debit balance that I finished before leaving office. So, for me, as a banker, I am unable to add anything to this scene. So, but on the other hand, imagine that I have a creative mind, I have a poet or something like that, and I add my emotions to this beautiful landscape and make much of it. Now, this is the expression that I just used. So, all people who are pragmatic and worldly, they may say, well, the writers and poets, they are always making much of it. So, well, there is the sunset. It is a scientific fact that when the sun sets, then the colors are the result of light coming through the layers of dust. So, that dusty explanation does not please the poet or the writer or the man of imagination. Somebody may believe in God. Even if I believe in God, I cannot establish any passage, either verbal, within the divine universal solicitude and the particular spectacle which I am considering. So if I believe in God, can I prove that there is a passage of communication, verbal or anything else, between divine solicitude and the spectacle? So can I point out, can I identify that God is pointing his finger and telling me, look, here is a beautiful sunset I have created for you. Even though I am a believer, unfortunately, I cannot see. God does not tell me anything. There is no sign. So, to say that he made the landscape in order to charm me, or that he made the kind of person who is pleased by it, is to take a question for an answer. That is how the Bible explains things. The Bible tells us God has created the world for us, for man to enjoy, and God has created man so that the world can be dominated. So God has created both, created the world for man, and he created man so that the world can be dominated, can be enjoyed. Shastra says this is taking a question for an answer, because it does not really answer anything. Is the marriage of this blue and that green deliberate? How can I know? The idea of universal providence is no guarantee of any particular intention, especially in the case under consideration. So the green of the grass is explained by biological laws, specific constants and geographical determinism, while the reason for the blue of the water is accounted for by the depth of the river, the nature of the soil and the swiftness of the current. So, universal providence, those who believe in providence, that cannot guarantee any particular intention. Like say you are a believer, you say that God has created the world, this beautiful world. But can you tell me that what was God's intention? No. You do not have any private communication from God unless you are Joan of Arc. Okay. So you do not have any private communication. You are only a believer. So you say, I believe, but I have not heard anything from God yet. Therefore, the questioner will not be satisfied by your answer. You cannot document, cannot show any document. A memo coming from God. Here is this beautiful scene. Please convey it to the questioner that it is created by me. You cannot show any kind of document like this, so the questioner is not satisfied. Which means that providence does not explain things according to Sartre. So, On the other hand, the science says that the color will depend upon a great number of factors, the depth of water and so on. The green of the glass depends upon other, biological, physiological, botanical and other kind of material factors. Is the particular mix of green and blue deliberate? How can I know? Deliberate means, has somebody on his own, by exercising his will, chosen this particular mix of colors? Is there any will active behind this universe? How can I know? So I do not know. The famous dictum of the Renaissance skeptics, he says, what do I know? The assorting of the shades, if it is willed, can only be something thrown into the bargain. Now here Sartre is poking us with Heideggerian philosophy. Heidegger says that man is thrown into this world. This thrownness is the quality of man. Geworfenheit. Geworfen means thrown. It is the meeting of two causal series, that is to say, at first sight, a fact of chance. So something is something may be accidentally thrown. So by chance, my purse falls from my pocket on the street. Do I throw the purse on the street? No. But the purse is thrown. Accidental, by chance. So it may be that man fell from God's pocket accidentally on this world. Geworfen, he is thrown onto this world accidentally. What is the guarantee that God willingly, deliberately put man in this world? It is also possible that man just fell from his pocket accidentally onto the world. So we cannot know that there is a will behind the creation. It is the meeting of two causal series. At best, the finality remains problematic. So the finality, whether it is man's existence in this world or the beautiful sunset, this finality we do not know from where it arrives. It remains problematic. All the relations we establish remain hypotheses. No end is proposed to us in the manner of an imperative. Since none is expressly revealed as having been willed by a creator, thus our freedom is never called forth by natural beauty. So, natural beauty does not call forth our freedom. That is, unlike a work of art, which calls us, which appeals to us, which cries out for us to exercise our freedom by reading the work of art, by reading the book or looking at the work of art. Natural beauty does not in the same way call us, according to Sartre. So he is differing from Kant on the question of the sublime. Rather, there is an appearance of order in the whole, which includes the foliage, the forms and the movements. Is the illusion of a calling forth which seems to solicit this freedom and which disappears immediately when one looks at it. Sartre accedes or concedes that yes, there is it seems that the natural beauty is calling us, but it is an illusion. When a work of art calls you, you read the book or look at the painting and you exercise your freedom, you immerse yourself in the book and you interpret the book. But when you look at a meadow of green grass, yes, it is apparently it calls your eyes, look here I am. But the moment you look at it, it disappears in the sense that It does not demand anything else from you. So it is an illusion. Even though there is an order in nature, it does not demand an active involvement of our consciousness. Hardly have we begun to run our eyes over this arrangement, then the appeal disappears. We remain alone, free to tie up one color with another or with a third, to set up a relationship between the tree and the water, or the tree and the sky, or the tree, the water and the sky. So, we remain alone in front of nature. Why we remain alone? We may still do something with nature. We may try to find a relationship between the sky, the tree, and the water and so on, and we may create a painting or we may write a poem. But nature does not work upon us or demand from us a reaction the same way a work of art does. Why? Because a work of art is the product of a consciousness. So there is a dialogue between the consciousness of the artist and the consciousness of the observer or the reader. But we cannot see that consciousness at work in nature, so there is no dialogue. My freedom becomes caprice. To the extent that I establish new relationships, I remove myself further from the illusory objectivity which solicits me. I muse about certain motives which are vaguely outlined by the things. The natural reality is no longer anything but a pretext for musing. So, the reader muses. What does musing mean? Or the looker-on, one who looks at natural beauty. Muses. Muses means that he speaks to himself. There is no dialogue. There is a monologue. There is perhaps a soliloquy. He is speaking to himself. Or in that case, because I have deeply regretted that this arrangement which was momentarily perceived was not offered to me by somebody and consequently is not real, the result is that I fix my dream, that I transpose it to canvas or in writing. The arrangement of things in nature, it does not appear to me real because it does not appear to me to be the product of a consciousness. So what can I do with it? I cannot have a dialogue with it. So at the most, I can fix my dream. That is, I work with my consciousness on it and either I make a painting or a drawing or I write a poem. So the point here is that in natural beauty there is no determinism. And the author can therefore begin to create on his own. Thus I interpose myself between the finality without end, which appears in the natural spectacles and the gaze of other men. What does it mean? This finality without end. It means that natural beauty or other people looking at me, it means that all this does not have a purpose. They do not have any will behind them. They do not have any consciousness behind them. I transmit it to them. What do I transmit it to them? Finality. By my own consciousness. It becomes human by this transmission. Art here is a ceremony of the gift, and the gift alone brings about the metamorphosis. So, the observer or the writer, he gives his consciousness to nature, and out of that creation of a poem or a painting becomes possible. It is something like the transmission of titles and powers in the matriarchate, but the mother does not possess the names, but is the indispensable intermediary between uncle and nephew. In a matriarchal system, it is the mother who is the provider of link between uncle and nephew, but she does not have a title or have a legal authority. She acts as an intermediary between the uncle and nephew. Sartre uses this example to illustrate that the consciousness of the writer or the observer acts as an intermediary which joins innate nature to the act of creation. So what happens here is the transmission of the consciousness of the observer. Since I have captured this illusion in flight, since I lay it out for other men and have disentangled it and rethought it for them, they can consider it with confidence. It has become intentional. So you see here Sartre is writing about the actions of a writer for a change. So long he was writing about the actions of a leader. Now he is writing about the actions of a writer. Now a writer, say a poet or an artist, who is looking at nature, or even other men who look at the author, their gaze. So men with gaze, they are still objects, unless you have a dialogue with them, which means that their consciousness is not active here. So nature or men who are like objects in nature looking at the author, that is transformed by the author, the writer, the painter into a work of art by his consciousness. So the writer has given these objects in nature his intention. So here Sartre is actually using Husserl's concept of intention. Inert objects which originally do not have any intention, they are given an intention when your consciousness works on them. As for me, I remain to be sure at the border of the subjective and the objective without ever being able to contemplate the objective arrangement which I transmit. The writer's consciousness lies in the border of the subjective and the objective. Now, you may say, no, the writer is the subject, therefore he is subjective, and the world is the object, therefore that is objective. But the thing is that the writer or the writer's consciousness works upon the object or works upon the world which he sees and invests it with an intention. Therefore the writer cannot be solely in the realm of the subject. He transcends to some extent and moves towards the object. Therefore he is at the border of the subject and the object. Think of a painter, student of an art college, who practices making still life. So he is drawing a still life on the canvas. He is constantly looking at the object, say an apple kept on a plate on the table. He is constantly looking at the object, infusing the object with his consciousness and draws on the canvas. So he is moving from his subjectivity to the object. He definitely gets something from the object and he transforms it with his subject, with his subjectivity, and creates the work of art. Similarly, a writer looks at the world, looks at the people around him, and he transforms it with his imagination, with his consciousness, with his subjectivity, and produces a work of art. I just remember a prose poem written by Jean Cocteau, the French surrealist poet. He describes the arriving of a train at the New Delhi railway station, and the poet Cocteau arrives at the station. He is a passenger of the train, and as the train enters the station, he looks out of the window and he sees that coolies in red dress, they are sitting on the platform here and there, and to him they appear to be like small pieces on a chessboard. So what do we see here? We see here that something objective which is transformed by Cocteau's consciousness and imagination. Cocteau does not say that the coolies are the pieces of a chessboard, or Cocteau does not say that the coolies sit like pieces which sit on a chessboard, but simply the coolies transform themselves in his imagination into pieces of a chessboard. So a metamorphosis takes place in his consciousness. That is the work of creation. That is when someone's subjectivity works on something objective, which is object, and transforms it into something else, into a work of art. So that is the magic of creation. That is the transformation. That is the metamorphosis. So if I meet you in the class, I remember, say, Mohini, I remember, say, Sohela or Pranita and so on. I come back home and then suddenly I write a poem. And because I remember something, I remember these students, but do I mention them in the poem? No. In my poem, they will be transformed into something else, in my consciousness. So whatever I imagined, whatever I saw, whatever I thought, the poets, the writers, they always transform things in their imagination, in the process of creation. So they do not remain the same. The objects or the people or the scenes of nature do not remain the same. They always get transformed by the working of the writer's consciousness. As for me, I remain to be sure at the border of the subjective and the objective, without being able to contemplate the objective arrangement which I transmit. The reader, on the contrary, progresses in security. So, right, Sartre says that I make this objective arrangement in my poem or in my book, but I cannot contemplate that arrangement. The writer cannot contemplate his own work. The reader, on the contrary, progresses in security. However far he may go, the author has gone farther. So, I think we discussed these things, no? I think we did all these things. I am repeating everything today. Anyway, since things are not very clear to us, there is no harm in repetition. They constitute, as we have said, the object of conjectures, and there is an experience of the reader but these conjectures are supported by the great certainty we have that the beauties which appear in the book are never accidental. The beauties which appear in a book, they are the product of the writer's consciousness. Unlike the beauties which appear in nature, they are accidental. So, in nature, the tree and the sky harmonize only by chance. If on the contrary in the novel, the protagonists find themselves in a certain tower, in a certain prison, if they stroll in a certain garden, it is a matter both of the restitution of independent causal series. The character had a certain state of mind which was due to a succession of psychological and social events. On the other hand, he betook himself to a determined place and the layout of the city required him to cross a certain path. So if you are writing a book, a novel, where you are representing a character in a prison or in a room, in a tower, and you represent some characters walking through a garden, then there is already a causality or a frame of causality in the book. Say you are representing Dublin, James Joyce is representing Dublin, and he is representing his character, say Stephen, walking from one place to another. But for going from one place to another, in between there is a path in Dublin. So there is this causality that if Joyce represents Stephen walking from this particular place to that particular place, he must mention the path because it falls in between. The causality of geography, the map of the place, he has to follow. So, on the other hand, he betook himself to a determined place and the layout of the city required him to cross a certain path and of the expression of a deeper finality, for the path came into existence only in order to harmonize with a certain state of mind, to express it by means of things, or to put it into relief by a vivid contrast, and the state of mind itself was conceived in connection with the landscape. Now Joyce will not introduce the path in his novel unless it helps him to express the state of mind of his character. So that is the deeper finality. So this finality is provided by the author's consciousness. So there is one kind of finality or determinism provided by the geography of Dublin. But there is another kind of determinism or finality provided by Joyce's consciousness. Joyce would introduce the part which will help him to represent the state of mind of Stephen. Otherwise he will not. Here it is causality which is appearance and which might be called causality without cause. And it is the finality which is the profound reality. This causality, the way the author chooses objects, chooses to represent them in his work, there is some causality, but it is causality without cause. Because this causality derives from the author's consciousness, not from any philosophical determinism. There is no force beyond the author's consciousness, any primordial force that dictates that these things must be like this. And the finality becomes a profound reality because it is expressed or it is created through the author's consciousness, and then it is perceived by the reader's consciousness, and thus it becomes profound reality because two consciousnesses work on it. So where does the author get the confidence that he will provide some kind of causality in his work. He gets this confidence from his consciousness. His consciousness will be working and make a particular arrangement of things. But this arrangement of things, he will create this arrangement of things, but he will not be able to contemplate it. And the reader gets the confidence that what he perceives is true, is real. Why? Because his consciousness works upon this arrangement created by the author and deduces meaning out of it. So for the reader it is real. Now, you may read a story, say by Poe, and you say it is a horrible story. That is real for you, for your consciousness. I may read that story and I say it is a very clever story, which means that I have read it in a different manner. That is real for my consciousness. If I can thus in all confidence put the order of ends under the order of causes, it is because by opening the book I am asserting that the object has its source in human freedom. So all discussion of cause, finality, order, determinism, where do they derive their authenticity? From the consciousness of the author who is exercising his freedom and the consciousness of the reader who is exercising his freedom based on existential philosophy. The work of art has some kind of authenticity, some kind of reality which is derived from the consciousness of the artist or the reader, which means that there is no a priori reality of the work of art. It exists only in the consciousness of the artist and the reader. Just as existentialism believes that there is no a priori existence of the world. The world is not there unless our consciousness works on it. Where existentialism differs from Kant. So Kant thinks that the world is already there, it is a fact, whether our consciousness works on it or not. Similarly, Kant also believes that the work of art is already there, present as a fact, whether our consciousness works on it or not. Sartre differs from him. And here he makes it very clear. He is actually explaining. He is explaining in a great detail how the consciousness of the author works and creates a particular kind of arrangement of the objects that he sees, how the consciousness of the reader works on it and provides it a particular meaning, and so on. And then the working of the author's consciousness or the reader's consciousness establishes what? It establishes the fact of human freedom. So this is the existential definition of freedom. If I were to suspect the artist of having written out of passion, and in passion my confidence would immediately vanish, for it would serve no purpose to have supported the order of causes by the order of ends. So when somebody writes with the passion, then he writes with particular end in mind. So this writing is teleological. So you write something, you want to make me angry, that is why you write it, and you send me a blistering email, you want to provoke me, you want to make me angry. So this piece of writing is not the creation of freedom, or it is not a true aesthetic object, because it has an end. It has a true purpose, it has a goal. Most of the political actions belong to this domain of purposiveness. Political actions are always taken with a goal in mind. So a political leader delivers a speech. His purpose is to anger a particular community and perhaps to provoke one community against another. So this kind of speech, can you say that it is a work of art? No. Why not? Is it poor in quality? Is it because that it is poor in quality? No. A very educated, articulate, able leader will be able to create a very skilled piece of rhetorical speech. So that is not poor in terms of use of language or anything, but still it is not a work of art. Why? Because it has a goal, it has an objective, it has an end. It is not created freely. My confidence also says, as a reader, will vanish if I know that the work is written out of a desire with a particular end in mind. The latter would be, so this kind of writing, this kind of works, what do we call them? We call them dogmatic works, because the author or the writer wants to preach a particular dogma through them. It could be the dogma of Hindutva, it could be the dogma of Christianity or whatever. It could be any dogma. So, what is a dogma? A dogma is something in which you believe. From an existential point of view, all such dogma is bad. Sartre says that it creates bad faith. Why? Because there is always a difference between what you believe and what you believe without trying to exercise your freedom, and what you perceive freely. Dogma is bad because you do not exercise your freedom when you believe in that. You keep your eyes shut. You do not ask questions. Anybody who has faith does not ask questions. That is the primary condition of having faith. You have faith in me, so you don't ask any question. Okay. So, from an existentialist point of view, freedom should not be suppressed, and if it is suppressed, then it is not interesting, it is no longer a work of art. The latter would be supported in its turn by psychic causality, and the work of art would end by re-entering the chain of determinism. So, if there is no exercise of freedom, then this work, work, which is a dogma, it will be supported by causality, and ultimately it will re-enter the chain of determinism. So, the whole purpose of freedom is to escape determinism. But if you have blind faith in something, then you are submitting or surrendering to a chain of causality. So if you are a Christian, let us imagine, then you are either a Roman Catholic or a Protestant of any particular faith, Lutheran or Calvinist or this or that. So one may say that it is determined what kind of a Christian you can be, a Syrian Christian or something. You have entered into a chain of causality and in the field of determinism. You cannot escape that. You cannot say I am a Christian but I am also a skeptic. You cannot say I am a Christian but I am also agnostic. You cannot say I am a Christian but I am also a scientist. Now there you stop me. Sir, this is not possible. There are so many scientist Christians or Christian scientists. But you see, this is anathema. Christianity cannot be proved by science. Faith cannot be proved by science. Then how can a scientist also be a Christian? Or how can a Christian be a scientist? So the two principles, go against each other. Like, you cannot be a communist and at the same time a believer in astrology. So you see in our country many communists with a lot of, gems, wearing a lot of gems either in on their fingers or otherwise, or wearing, talisman, madhuni. So these are communists who believe in astrology. Probably one day we will see communists doing a yogya. So if communists can believe in astrology, then they can do a yogya also. So these things do not go together. I mean, if you are to be sincere in your logic, logically they do not go together. Certainly I do not deny when I am reading that the author may be impassioned, not even that he might have conceived the first plan of his work under the sway of passion, but his decision to write supposes that he withdraws somewhat from his feelings. In short, that he has transformed his emotions into free emotions, as I do mine while reading him, that is, that he is in an attitude of generosity. So what Shastri is explaining here is generosity. So you may be believing in a particular ideology, but when you write a book, if you write a book solely on the basis of that ideology, and there is no scope for any, broad interpretation of your book, then it becomes a dogmatic book. It is confined in that particular dogma, and you do not have any freedom to go beyond that dogma, nor does the reader have any freedom to interpret that book beyond that dogma. So, writing or reading such a book is like entering a blind alley. You have no escape. So this is against the principle of freedom, and it is a futile exercise. Say, I am writing a book on Hindutva principle. Why should I write it? Golwalkar and other, founders, they have spoken elaborately, articulately on that. So if I still want to write that book on Hindutva, then I will manage writing only a book of secondary importance, because I am not offering any free thought here. I am slavishly trying to represent the thought of another person or another faith, a particular faith, a particular creed. So this is the status of all ideologies which are by definition closed. So once something is a dogma, it is closed, means that it cannot be further developed. Now I do not want to offend anybody. I am just exercising my logic. So say there are some religions of the book, which say that this book is final, it cannot be improved. This book is final, this is the work of God, it cannot be improved. So much so that nobody even dares to say anything by interpreting the verses of the book, because everything has already been finalized by God or whoever created that book. Therefore, that book or that belief, that faith, does not offer you any freedom. Any freedom to exercise your logic, to exercise your choice, to exercise your imagination. So, with respect to that book or that kind of faith, you can only be a follower, a blind follower. So, who is a blind follower? One who never asks questions. So, suppose someday the follower thinks that, well, I am following this particular faith, but my friend, she is following another faith. So how is it possible that my faith and her faith both claim to be right, both claim to be the last word? So how is it possible? Now the moment this follower begins to think in this fashion, he stops being a follower, because she doubts the dogma. She doubts that it is the final word, and she starts looking elsewhere. Okay. Which means that she starts exercising her freedom. But as long as she believes that only my faith is correct and all other faith, all other books, they are wrong, she represses her logic. She represses the questions that naturally rise within her. She represses her logic and refuses to exercise her freedom. And this kind of dogma gives rise to fundamentalism. So fundamentalism is like essentialism to some extent. You do not ask questions about something which is fundamental, which is accepted as, by definition true. What is by definition true? That is, I have said that this is true, or somebody said that this is true and this is the final word, therefore it cannot be questioned. So that is the fundamental thing. Therefore, there is no generosity in this kind of work or in this kind of exercise. But Sartre says that reading, writing, these are acts of generosity. The writer must provide some space for the reader to interpret it in her own way, and the reader also must accept the creative freedom of the writer. Thus, reading is a pact of generosity between author and reader. Each one trusts the other, each one counts on the other, demands of the other as much as he demands of himself. For this confidence is itself generosity. Nothing can force the author to believe that his reader will use his freedom. How can the author get this confidence that the reader will exercise his freedom? There is nothing that can give him this confidence. So I write a book and I expect that Mohini will read it and exercise her freedom and understand the book in her own way, not in the way that I intended it to mean, but in her own way. Well, I have confidence in Mohini, so I can believe that. But somebody else from the market buys my book, do I have the confidence that that reader will exercise my freedom? No, naturally not. Nothing can force the reader to believe that the author has used his. So there is nothing which can force the author or the reader to believe that the other person will exercise his freedom. But still he believes that it is possible. So when I have released a book in the market, I believe that all the readers, excepting the stupid ones of course, that all the readers will read my book in their own way, exercise their judgment and find their own meanings in my book. And that is that confidence. Where do I get that confidence? Out of generosity. So I am generous. I give my readers space and therefore I am confident. Similarly, the reader is confident that the author has left this space for him for interpreting the work. So the reader is confident because she believes that the author is generous enough, or that the author is not a fundamentalist, because a fundamentalist is not generous. So in that case you have the choice of not to buy the book. If you believe that the author is a fundamentalist, you do not buy the book. So both of them make a free decision. There is then established a dialectical going and coming. When I read, I make demands. If my demands are met, what I am then reading provokes me to demand more of the author, which means to demand of the author that he demand more of me. So it is a two-way process. The author demands of the reader that he looks at the book closely and exercises his freedom, reads the book his own way, and similarly the reader makes a demand upon the author that the author gives him more space and so on. And vice versa, the author's demand is that I carry my demands to the highest pitch. Thus my freedom by revealing itself reveals the freedom of the author. This freedom is not merely intellectual freedom. The intellectual freedom is of course there. The author allows the reader to use his or her judgment freely. And the reader allows the author to use his or her creativity freely. But apart from intellectual freedom, or besides intellectual freedom, Sartre is talking about existential freedom. The very fact that the author chooses to write a book, he exercises his freedom. Why should anybody write a book? Considering the fact that he cannot himself judge his own book, or perhaps even enjoy his own book, because he knows everything from the beginning. So why should we take this trouble? Everybody writes a book for others. So by definition, writing a book is an act of generosity. You are writing for others. And when you are writing for others, evidently you would like to leave space for others. So as you expect generosity from the readers, similarly the readers also expect generosity from you. It matters little whether the aesthetic object is the product of realistic art or supposedly such, or formal art. Realistic art within inverted commas, that is the work of art which mimetically represents reality, or formal art, that is work of art which emphasizes on form rather than content. So these distinctions do not matter much according to Sartre. At any rate, the natural relations are inverted. That tree on the first plane of the Cézanne painting first appears as the product of a causal chain, but the causality is an illusion. It will doubtless remain as a proposition as long as we look at the painting, but it will be supported by a deep finality. If the tree is placed in such a way, it is because the rest of the painting requires that this form and those colors be placed on the first plane. So Sartre explains the phenomenological interpretation of what a painting does, what a work of art does. So, if we see that a great painter like Cézanne, who has represented a tree at a particular place within the canvas, then it is a proposition in the sense that Cézanne could have painted that tree perhaps in that canvas in a different position or on a different place in the canvas. Therefore it is a proposition. But does this proposition have any finality? Is it compulsory for Cézanne to paint that tree where he has painted it, or he could have placed the tree upwards or downwards on the canvas? So Sartre says that within the frame of the canvas there is a causality of composition. Every artist knows that he has to compose his painting. He has to design where to place what. And this is dictated not by the artist's whims, but by the aesthetic dictation of causality. And when the artist follows that causality and paints it accordingly, then it acquires a finality in the painting. Thus, through the phenomenal causality, our gaze attains finality as the deep structure of the object, and beyond finality, it attains human freedom as its source and original basis. So, Sartre calls it phenomenal causality. So, how the artist will, make that painting, how he will compose the painting, it is dictated by some causality. But when we look at it, then we look at it as a phenomenon, and we follow the phenomenal causality. We try to follow the phenomenal causality. We try to understand how the composition is as it is. And when we look at the painting, try to understand its composition, try to also understand the phenomenological, philosophical compulsions behind the painting, then what do we achieve? Freedom. Because the painting allows us to exercise our freedom in interpreting it, in understanding it. Therefore, you see, this point of view bypasses aesthetic debates or aesthetic quarrels about realistic art, formalistic art. It bypasses the aesthetic debates because it looks at the philosophical, underlying philosophical, phenomenological explanation. Vermeer's realism, alluding to another famous painter, Vermeer, Vermeer's realism is carried so far that at first it might be thought to be photographic. But if one considers the splendor of his texture, the pink and velvety glory of his little brick walls, the blue thickness of a branch of woodbine, the glazed darkness of his vestibules, the orange-colored flesh of his faces, which are as polished as the stone of holy water basins, one suddenly feels in the pleasure that he experiences that the finality is not so much in the forms or colors as in his material imagination. It is the very substance and temper of the things which here give the forms their reason for being. With this realist, we are perhaps closest to absolute creation, since it is in the very passiveness of the matter that we meet the unfathomable freedom of man. What is Sartre saying here is that he says that the way Vermeer represents the objects in his painting, it reflects his material imagination. That is how he looks at these matters. Suppose somebody's bright face, pink face, or pink wall, or the texture of something, some material, a face which looks like a polished stone, and so on. So the qualities with which Vermeer invests the object, the material objects, that represents his material imagination, where he is exercising his freedom. And the forms, the colors, they all reflect this material imagination. And therefore Vermeer's realistic art ends up by providing us with a passiveness of matter. All these material objects that he depicts, they seem to remain passive. Passive in which sense? That they invite our active imagination to work on them. And this passivity of these materials, they make us realize the unfathomable freedom of man. So Sartre says that, well, this art may be realistic, or somebody's art may be formalistic, but as long as the work of art represents or reflects the creativity of the artist, the freedom of the artist's consciousness, and also the unfathomable freedom of the observer, a man who looks at the painting, as long as it is reflected by this work, then it is a work of art which is worth painting and which is worth looking at. Because in ultimate analysis, it allows a man to exercise his freedom. The work is never limited to the painted, sculpted or narrated object. Just as one perceives things only against the background of the world, so the objects represented by art appear against the background of the universe. Sartre here gives the example of French novelist Stendhal. This character Fabrice in Stendhal's novel The House of Parma, the Charterhouse of Parma. So he says that the objects are perceived in the background of the world, and on the background of the adventures of Fabrice are the Italy of 1820, Austria, France, the sky and stars which the Abbe Blanes consults, and finally the whole earth, if the painter presents us with a field or a vase of flowers. His paintings are windows which are open on the whole world. So the way Stendhal represents Italy of 1820 and Austria and France in his novel The Charterhouse of Parma, he provides the context, the background. He opens a window for us. So Sartre means to say here that the work of art is never limited to the painted, sculpted or narrated object. That is, one always transcends these barriers. The work of art opens farther windows for us to exercise our freedom in understanding the world. He gives the example of Van Gogh. We follow the red path which is buried among the wheat much farther than Van Gogh has painted it. Much farther than Van Gogh has painted it. Which means that when we follow that red path in the painting, by our imagination we walk farther and farther the painting never acts as a barrier. On the other hand, it opens a window for us in our imagination. Among other wheat fields under other clouds, to the river which empties into the sea and which extends to infinity, to the other end of the world, a deep finality which supports the existence of the field and the earth. So, an artist opens a small window through which one can see the infinite universe. Therefore, its effect is liberating, not constricting. The opposite of something dogmatic, the effect of that is constricting. You cannot go beyond that. But the effect of true art is liberating. So that through the various objects which it produces or reproduces, the creative act aids at the total renewal of the world. So the creative act offers an opportunity to the viewer or the reader to renew the world through their imagination, through their consciousness. Each painting, each book is a recovery of the totality of being. So, totality and infinity are also philosophical terms. Levinas has a book on totality. So, Sartre here is talking about the totality of being. Each of them presents this totality to the freedom. Each painting, each book is a recovery of the totality of being. So let us imagine that our consciousness, each of us has a particular consciousness, which is a small window. Now, your window may be larger than mine, my window may be smaller than yours, but my consciousness is a window, your consciousness is a window. Window to what? Window to the world, because we perceive the world through our consciousness. So the world is there to be perceived. So, if we replace the term world by the term being, the Heideggerian term, Dasein, being that is there, then can we perceive the entire being with our small window of consciousness? Sartre says that each work of art tries to recover for us totality of being. Recover. That is something which we have lost or which is not within our purview, but that must be recovered. The totality of being. So, when we are sitting in the class and discussing something, are we projecting our consciousness to think of the totality of being? No. Because the teacher appears to be the totality to you at that moment. You are totally absorbed by whatever he is saying. So you forget the totality of being. But when you are alone in your room, you are reading a book, or you have gone to an exhibition and you are looking at a painting, then the book, the painting helps you to recover the totality of being which is there. Now if you are a literalist, then you will say, sir, the painting only represents a part of reality. How can we see the totality of being there? But that is a literalist interpretation. That is not what Sartre means. Sartre means to say that you do not see only with your eyes, you see with your imagination. So by looking at the painting, by your imagination you travel the parts of the world. You recover much of the world, much of the being there, outside there. When you read a poem, do you keep restricted yourself to the words of the poem? No. You do not know when you are thinking about something else. In the middle of reading, your imagination, it cannot be changed. Perhaps you are remembering other poems. Perhaps you are thinking of some experiences in your life. You are recovering what you have lost or what was out of your purview. The poem reminds you of that. You are recovering as much of the being as possible. Well, I have spoken for too long, so if you have any questions, you can ask.